doctors and family be allowed to pull the plug? The death dilemma has become even more crucial with the development of organ transplantation and the need for those organs. In 2 weeks, we'll be presenting a special hour-long report on organ transplants and the shortage of donors. But tonight, in a kind of preface, we begin a series on death itself, a dilemma with many questions and answers not always that clear.
For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. Those familiar lines from the Old Testament are still very profound, but in these complex modern times, their meaning may have changed some. The time to die is no longer as simple as it used to be. When is a person dead, and when should he be allowed to die, are some of the perplexing questions we may all have to face.
As our therapies become more effective in saving lives, we're all going to be faced with the dilemmas of when to withhold treatment, either in patients who are brain damaged or patients who are terminally ill. And just the fact that you can resuscitate anyone means that there are certain patients who should not be resuscitated, and this is a very common dilemma.
The fear, of course, is to allow someone to die who might otherwise have miraculously recovered. One of the most dramatic cases of someone returning from a seemingly lost state occurred in our own backyard. Minneapolis Police Sergeant David Mack was shot in December of '79 while trying to serve a search warrant. He remained unconscious for several months. In August of 1980, he is taken off a respirator, but he continues to breathe on his own. Still, it's decided not to treat any medical complications. Should he die, he dies. More than a year later, in October of '81, a doctor communicates with Mack. The recovery has begun. And today, Sergeant David Mack, though severely paralyzed, has regained nearly 95% of his intellectual capacities. Mack never was declared brain dead. His was described as a persistent vegetative state, and that's an important distinction. In such a state, the top half of the brain has been lost. It no longer functions. But the bottom half is still working, allowing for such actions as breathing. Sergeant Mack is only the second person in medical recorded history to come out of a persistent vegetative state. Brain death is the irreversible cessation of total brain function, and doctors insist the diagnosis of brain death is extremely reliable. Hoping for a miracle like Sergeant Mack's is Marvell Harris. Her son Dwayne was the victim of a stabbing 6 years ago. He went into surgery, and during the operation, his heart stopped, he lost blood to the brain, and he's been in a persistent vegetative state ever since.
Can you feel that, Dwayne? Open your eyes. Dwayne, can you let me know you're here? Come on.
Marvell believes that somehow at times she is able to communicate with Dwayne.
In this PVS state, I think they have highs and lows. That when they are high, that we communicate a lot, and when he's low, he sleeps a lot. And during this time, it's hard to explain, but they do have some type of different awarenesses that let me know that maybe he does hear me, and maybe deep down in that they have filtering thoughts that maybe not like you and I, but they do understand. And he has given me some reactions at different times. The clinical view of it is that they don't. It's the brainstem that is still working. My view is it's the human love that you're filtering through.
Marvell says she will probably be debt-ridden for the rest of her life. The cost of caring for Dwayne is $400 a day. Insurance does not cover all. But she will continue her vigil, and her hope is that society will provide more facilities to care for those like Dwayne, and through research gain a better understanding of how and why people sometimes return from the persistent vegetative state. For others, most often when their relative is diagnosed brain dead,
the kinds of people who become donors, well, unfortunately, they're the ones that are young, previously healthy, have been in the hospital for a very short period of time. Usually people who are out having a good time, have partying, whatever, have car accidents, motorcycle accidents, some kind of trauma.
Come on! to us, we see in donation an alternative to the finality of this tragic event, a way to pass on this life to someone else who is in great need.
Jim Feehan has an easy smile and a quick and contagious laugh. He considers life good and each day a gift. 2 years ago, he was told he had a terminal heart condition, meaning he would soon die the way things were. But doctors at the University of Minnesota transplanted the heart of a young woman into Jim's chest and gave him a new lease on life. Good evening. I'm John Bachman. The University of Minnesota has been giving life and happiness on operating room tables for nearly 20 years now. Since the first kidney transplant in 1963, the program has expanded to other types of organs with a steadily rising success and survival rate. Today, the University of Minnesota is a world leader in organ transplants. The first transplants involved experiments with skin, animal, and human blood over 300 years ago. But it was a hit-and-miss affair, and many patients given the wrong blood died. The typing of blood into the major groups was accomplished in the early 1900s, and that was the real beginning of successful transplants. It led to the matching of other body tissues and great strides in solving one of the major problems of organ transplants, the body's rejection of the organ. As we near the end of the 20th century, doctors know a lot more about the body, and scientists are developing new drugs to help fight rejection.
There's a genetic system very similar to the genetic system which we worry about when we do a blood transfusion, which is, of course, the ABO blood group system. And the genetic system we worry about in transplantation is much more complex. It's called HLA, the major histocompatibility complex. It really doesn't matter, but it's a very complex system. But we're learning how to match for the different components of this HLA system in a much more sophisticated manner and in a much more practical manner. And I think the joint use of the best immunosuppressive drugs together with optimal matching, I think will show the underpinnings for great progress in the next few years.
The Uniform Donor Act means that by signing a donor card, you can leave vital organs behind when you die. Well, that may not be a comfortable thing to say or consider, but it's real. And it's a way to give meaning to death by giving life to someone else. It's a generous but simple act. Sign the donor card, carry it with you. If you change your mind, destroy the card. You can call for a donor card now at 373-8814.
Hard-working people just don't have time for a bank that can't keep up with them. That's why you...
In the treatment of final-stage kidney disease, there are only two life-saving options: transplant or dialysis. A dialysis machine performs the failing kidney's role of purifying the blood. Today, more than 45,000 Americans depend on dialysis treatments 3 times a week to keep them alive. But dialysis can have medical and psychological side effects, including chronic fatigue and depression. About half of all dialysis patients are suitable candidates for kidney transplants. The other half are too old or are not suitable for other medical reasons. A kidney transplant costs about $22,000 for the operation and $1,500 a year in follow-up expenses. Dialysis costs about $23,000 each year the patient receives treatment. Both procedures are paid for by the federal Medicare program. Not only are transplants far more cost-effective, they also offer a better chance for a normal life, especially for children and diabetic patients who do not fare well on dialysis. Minnesota has 4 major kidney transplant centers. They are the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, and in the Twin Cities area, the Veterans Hospital, Hennepin Medical Center, and the University of Minnesota Hospitals. In fact, the university has the largest and most successful kidney transplant program in the world. More than 1,500 transplants have been done here under the direction of Chief Transplant Surgeon Dr. John Najarian.
Our results are better than any other transplant unit in the world by some 10%. And we're very pleased about that. We're pleased because it's a strong team of doctors, nurses, and technicians that take very good care of patients. The drugs that we have available to us And all this coupled together, it's a team effort, has resulted in superb and quite superior results in our transplant program.
I think it's great that, like, somebody can take something from, their body and put it into another person's body that doesn't have it, and they could just be normal like everybody else.
16-year-old Gina Mancinelli recently came to the University of Minnesota with her parents, Julie and Dan, from their home in Atlanta, Georgia. Gina needs a kidney transplant. Her father will be the donor, giving one of his 2 normal kidneys to Gina. Dan Mancinelli chose to have the operation done here.
A friend of mine in Atlanta had a transplant here 5 years ago and told me about the service. And in checking with my family and friends in New York and in California, whenever the University of Minnesota was mentioned, it was mentioned as a premier spot for kidney transplants because of the number of transplants that they do perform here. So that's why we decided to come to the University of Minnesota.
Gina went on dialysis last November after her family first discovered that both her kidneys were failing to function properly.
We think it's a long time that she's been sick, but we didn't realize it, and we as parents only noticed that she was lethargic, and she had lost her California tan, and she lost her appetite, and we thought it was from being depressed. But we found out about 2 or 3 weeks prior to the initial hospitalization that it was more than that. She developed bruises on her arms and legs and swelling in the calves of her legs, and became extremely exhausted in climbing a flight of stairs. And after being hospitalized, we found out she had just 5% functioning.
On the morning of the transplant, Gina and Dan are wheeled to adjoining operating rooms.
Hi, Gina. How are you doing?
A little nervous, huh? Other than that, I'm fine. But after the anesthesia, I'll be better.
And you're not allergic to anything. Do you know which kidney they're going to take?
My left.
Your left. Okay. I'll be right back to get you, okay?
Okay.
Gina will be operated on by surgeons Nigerian and Nancy Asher. They are assisted by a team of anesthesiologists and special nurses. Giving up a kidney involves major surgery, but Dan Mancinelli says that decision was easy for him to make.
Actually, there's no hesitation on my part at all. In fact, I'd gladly trade places with her, and I'm sure most parents would do the same thing.
Both operations began at the same time and will last about 2 hours. Gina had her diseased kidneys removed in previous surgery, so today her abdomen is opened and made ready to accept her father's kidney. Dan is also put under a general anesthetic, and surgeon Bruce Summer opens his left side to remove the kidney. Meanwhile, Julie Mancinelli anxiously waits for the operations on her husband and daughter to end.
We just never, I've heard where people have had news of this sort handed to them, and it's very depressing to hear those kind of stories. And you just never think of it, it's going to happen to you, and you feel like we take too much for granted, and then all of a sudden it hits you, and you have to face reality and deal with what you have the best you can, and that's exactly what I feel like we've done.
At last, everything is ready, and the donor kidney is carefully carried into Gina's operating room by Dr. Nigerian.
We simply take the kidney out of the donor and cut the artery and the vein and the ureter, the conduit, urinary conduit to the bladder, out of the donor, take it across to the other room, and sew it into the recipient. The recipient's in the hospital for maybe 10 days to 2 weeks after that, while they're recovering from the operation and receiving drugs that were used to suppress the immune response.
The bluish kidney is about the size of a large potato, but once transplanted, it will shrink to accommodate itself to Gina's body and then grow with her. 2 weeks after surgery, father and daughter are up and walking and ready to go home. Dan can live a completely normal life with his remaining kidney. Gina will have to take medication to ensure her body does not reject the transplanted organ. But the close genetic relationship between Gina and her father give her an excellent chance for a long and normal life.
I can't wait to get home, and I don't even have to go to dialysis. Now I can go home and just be like anybody else.
About half of all kidney transplants involve living related donors, such as Dan Mancinelli. The other half of the transplants are known as cadaver kidneys. In these cases, the donated kidney comes from someone who has recently died and whose family has agreed to donate the organs after death has been pronounced. In such cases, the kidneys can be preserved in special machines for about 48 hours. This means cadaver kidneys can be shipped all over the world for transplant.
We have 200 people, maybe 250 now, on the cadaver waiting list, waiting for a cadaver kidney. When one becomes available, we go through the list and we look for who is the closest match. That might be only 2 or 3 people out of the 250. Often only one person really turns out to be the right one. If there are 3, then you say, how do you choose? We choose by medical necessity, the one who's doing the poorest, perhaps on dialysis, or the one who may have been on dialysis the longest, or we've had the most trouble finding a kidney for. There's always a medical reason for choosing that particular patient, so that we never have to get into the moral or the ethical dilemma of who shall live or who shall die or who shall receive a kidney or not.
Steve Erickson of Minneapolis has been living with a cadaver kidney for 16 years now. Steve begins his day at the family breakfast table taking a few steroid pills which help prevent his body from rejecting the kidney. The medication makes his skin sensitive to sunlight and his face slightly puffy, but those are minor setbacks. He and his wife Pat and adopted daughters Jody Ray and Julianne otherwise live a normal family life.
Of course, I have future plans. I plan in the future on trips and everything else, things that I'd like to accomplish. As long as this kidney keeps working, I'll be able to do that, and I have no reason to believe otherwise. I think I feel great all the time.
And we knew each other before we got married. I knew Steve when he had the transplant and before he had the transplant. And we just got married without any fears or just expecting a normal life, just as we are leading a normal life right now.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Goodbye, Daddy.
Steve Erickson leads an active life and works as a drafting salesman.
Good morning, Scotty. How you doing? Good. That thing run pretty good?
It was a good one.
Erickson doesn't know much about the person who saved his life, only that the donor was a 28-year-old man who died in heart surgery. The transplant was so long ago, Steve says he rarely thinks about it, but he's fully aware of its significance.
Well, they have done some checking, the Kidney Foundation did, and they figure it's the oldest in the United States, but they got a hunch that it could be the oldest in the world, too, that there isn't anybody around. Now, that's with a kidney that is non-relative. This is a completely cadaver situation. There are people that are walking around that had kidney transplants for 20 years, maybe 22 years even. But from a cadaver, 16 years is probably the oldest.
Steve Erickson was living in northern Minnesota when he discovered he needed a transplant at the University of Minnesota hospitals. In fact, more than half of all final-stage kidney patients treated in the Twin Cities live in rural areas of Minnesota or other states. And the need for temporary housing is one of their greatest expenses. In an effort to help out, officials from the Kidney Foundation are searching for property in the Twin Cities area to convert into a special kidney house. They hope to raise $1 million for the project. $200,000 toward that goal have already been pledged by the American Legion and VFW. The Kidney House is planned as a home away from home for the patients and their families who come here for treatment such as dialysis and transplants.
It is definitely worthwhile due to the people that are in dire needs for this type of housing when they are in here on dialysis and for transplants. And I guess probably the thing that impressed us the most was the over 1,300 people with kidney transplants throughout North and South Dakota and Minnesota, and anticipating a 54% increase in 1982.
Depending on the need of the individual kidney patient. The cost will be anywhere from free to a maximum of $10 for the patient and patient family.
"25 different tissues and body organs can now be successfully transplanted: the kidney, pancreas, liver, cornea, heart, and others. Most have an extremely high success rate. However, only 4 of every 10 persons needing an organ transplant ever get it. More organs are needed so more people can live, and a donor card is all that's needed to give life. Call 373-8.
Transplant operations and the success rates are steadily getting better. That puts pressure on the supply of organs and the need for donors. It also fans a growing debate on the closely related issue of brain death. When is a person dead?
It used to be the day when someone died, they were cold and dead, and you and I and everybody else would know they were dead. There was no question. Today we have the capabilities of keeping people alive with artificial support devices. If their heart stops, we can pump for them, use the artificial heart or balloon pumps that we have. If they can't breathe, we can breathe for them. If their blood pressure falls, we can raise it back up again. It's at the point now where we can virtually keep someone alive in a state of what it would look like externally to be life, which is not life. Then somewhere along the line, somebody says, well, pull the plugs. Well, it's hard to pull the plugs because you must determine they're dead. The heart's beating because we're making it beat, so that's not a cause for death. So it really gets down to the one thing that differentiates us from all other beasts, and that's our brain. And if the brain is dead, and then we're really vegetating. We have only the vegetative functions that we're endowed with, and that should be synonymous with death. And that's all brain dead law says.
Minnesota does not have a brain death law. Bills have been introduced but never passed.
Well, I think primarily we don't have a brain death statute in Minnesota for political reasons. We have a very powerful pro-life movement who has vigorously opposed this bill, and I think they've done it primarily for political reasons rather than directly related to the issues of defining death, and I think that's why we don't have one in Minnesota.
Well, it's been MCCL's position that a law is unnecessary and that it would have some potential dangers that we're not willing to risk under the circumstances. Doctors are free now to use the brain death concept, and they do use it in diagnosing death. And we feel that it's not necessary to oppose that in order to be against a law that would legislate the concept of brain death. Actually, it's really breaking precedent because Minnesota, as many other states, have never defined death by statute. And we feel that if this is to be done, there should be some very overriding reasons to do so, and we haven't seen those presented.
There is no question that to a certain extent, doctors may run a risk of civil or criminal liability in these situations, and this is what's happened on the brain death issue as we predicted around the country, that cases have arisen where physicians were potentially criminally liable for discontinuing support on a brain dead patient. And of course around the country the courts have found that brain death is equivalent to the death of the person. But these are issues where the legislatures have never addressed this problem. And ultimately the courts and the legislatures are going to have to address these and develop some type of social policy.
All physicians are capable of pronouncing brain death with no controversy. There shouldn't be any. And if there's doubt in their mind, they should get another medical opinion or some expert in to help them out in the situation. They shouldn't go out and cite legislation, which only, again, it only invites legal recourse in areas of dispute.
I think there are legal aspects to all of this. I think that part of developing a social policy on defining death, allowing to die, is through the courts and through the legislatures, because that's the ultimate way that social policies are determined.
There are times when, because the lack of a brain dead law, we cannot declare someone dead until they are too far gone so that their organs could be used and still vital for someone else.
North Memorial Hospital is a trauma center, meaning it deals with the issues of brain death and organ donation more than other hospitals. It also means the nurses and doctors must deal with tragedy and emotion.
Yesterday he went over for a femoral to femoral bypass,
His both legs are cool. His left leg is cold. They're both kind of a bluish gray color. I can't feel any pulses. Kelly thinks maybe he can. We're trying to find a Doppler to see. They don't look very good.
Initially, all our efforts then are poured into reversing this problem, in saving a life. And when these efforts are to no avail, it leaves us feeling extremely helpless and frustrated. And so, to us, we see in donation an alternative to the finality of this tragic event. And in many cases, we, the nurses, become involved in this grieving process, not to the extent certainly that the family does, but we also grieve with the family. Unfortunately, so often we're caught up in the busyness and the tasks that need to be done that we have to sort of postpone or put our feelings in the back of our mind. Generally, once the decision has been made and the patient is to be used for a donor, after the experience is over, quite often we find that the nurses then kind of stand back, and that lump that you have been carrying around in your throat finally gives way to emotions and a release of emotions. We often end up going into a corner and crying.
This specially marked ambulance frequently carries brain death victims who will be organ donors. The ambulance and its paramedic crew are equipped to keep the hearts and lungs of brain death victims pumping until the organs can be used for transplant. Recently, the ambulance rushed the body of a 38-year-old woman to the University of Minnesota hospitals. She had suffered a severe stroke and was declared brain dead at St. Paul Ramsey Medical Center. In cases such as this, the victim's organs can be kept functioning for several hours. But once taken off a respirator, the victim stops breathing. In this case, the family consented to the university's request for cadaver organs for transplant. But the victim had never discussed organ donation with her family, so they had to make their decisions based solely on the need of potential recipients, which included 2 kidney patients and a man who needed a heart transplant.
It is a very difficult part of my job, and yet I feel it's so very important that a family has the right to make an informed consent about donating their loved one's organs. It's a very stressful time in their lives. You know, they're there yesterday or this morning or whatever, their loved one was perfectly fine walking around, being just fine, and now somebody is telling them that they are dead, that they're brain dead, and another stranger, being me, is brought in to talk to them about possible organ donation.
Meet Trudy and young Luke Potter of Montevideo, Minnesota. And that's Trudy's husband and other son Eric playing basketball. This close-knit family suffered a tragic loss last year. A freakish car accident outside the family home claimed the life of Ron and Trudy's 11-year-old daughter, Rhonda. Like many car accident victims, Rhonda died of head injuries. After Rhonda was declared brain dead, the Potters consented to a request for her organs for transplant. Trudy and Ron say nothing can replace their loss, but the family is thankful they had discussed organ donation with their children before the accident.
That's probably one of the hardest moments or decisions for you to make right there, is to convince yourself in your own mind that she, or, you know, it's beyond reversing itself. But I think once you come to that decision, the rest is fairly easy.
Rhonda's heart was transplanted into another young girl, Cindy Spicer of St. Paul at the University of Minnesota. Cindy lived 5 active months with the transplant before her body suddenly rejected the heart.
We would really have liked it to have been much longer, but she had 5 months that she wouldn't have had otherwise, and there's something in that.
The Potters have never regretted their decision to donate Rhonda's organs after she died. In fact, Trudy and Ron frequently give talks to friends, neighbors, and civic groups about the value of signing donor cards. And they stress the importance of deciding before a tragic death whether or not you want to be a donor.
death is a part of life also, and it's something we can't hide from. We have to face up to the fact that at one time or another we are all going to be leaving the physical life, and why not pass something on to somebody? I don't think that it's a situation of that, you know, everybody can handle, and I think it should be discussed beforehand a little bit to get your own personal feelings out in the open on it.
I don't know why I was chosen to receive what I call a God-given man-made miracle. And it took me from bedridden end-stage cardiac heart failure to where I'm back leading a good, normal life. And these are days that are free to me. I didn't have any claim on them. Without this new heart, I wouldn't have had them. So I'm very grateful for them.
53-year-old Jim Feehan says he belongs to the most exclusive club in the world. To be a member, you have to be living a normal life with a transplanted heart. For Jim, normal means working 7 days a week in his restaurant in Glencoe, where he's considered something of a local celebrity, playing golf, flying airplanes, and generally being active and busy. It also means regular trips to the U of M hospitals for checkups. So far, everything is fine. There have been no signs of rejection after almost 2 years, and each day tips the odds more heavily in Jim's favor.
Rejection is a diminishing possibility. The longer I survive with this heart, the less likelihood it is that I'll reject it.
Doctors say Jim is doing so well because he and his donor were an excellent match.
I've heard there are basically 7 or 8 points that they're looking to match up between blood and tissue type and so on. And that mine was almost a perfect match between my donor and myself. And of course, my donor is, to me, an unknown lady that carried a letter in her purse that if she was ever in a certain death situation, she wanted her organs used to preserve life. And as I indicated to you, her corneas were transplanted, her kidneys were transplanted, and of course her heart beats on in me. The miracle of that story is that 5 different lives affected out of a very generous act. The day before the surgery, Dr. Goldsmith, Francis, and Dr. Ferguson all came to my bed about, it was early in the morning, 9 or 8:30 in the morning. And the 3 of them came, and I was reasonably sure they didn't want a 4th for bridge. And they told me they had a very iffy situation. They needed blood and tissue for hematology matchups and so on. And they suggested that I stick pretty close to the phone. And that's got to be the longest day of my life. And I really had a mixed bag of emotions, too, again here now. I was coming very close to the surgery, which I wanted desperately. I wanted to live. And yet, if you can relate to this, I really didn't want somebody else to die. 6 o'clock in the evening, Dr. Anderson called. The message was very short. He said, "We're going ahead, come on over." So the kids were driving me from the VA to the university. I had really been committed to this thing. It was a chance. I'm going to live with a heart transplant. But now that the moment was really here, I wasn't that sure. I just soon we took a side trip to Chicago and came back in a week or so. They had told me before the surgery that the odds of getting a transplant were not good, and the odds of surviving any reasonable period of time after the surgery were not that good either. But on waking up, that was, to really answer your question, that was my first thought, my God, I'm alive. My family and I are really very close. One of the kind of neat things I think that happened during this whole thing is I said I have 4 kids, they're all adults. Well, we threw away the parent-child thing and we became friends, which is kind of nice. They were very, very strong and supportive to me during this whole thing. They knew the risks. They knew what was involved. The night of the surgery, they were taken to a private waiting room while I was in the surgery. And they sat there and they were playing cards for a couple hours, they said, before one of them realized what they were doing. Sitting there playing hearts. I'll never be accused of being a pious person, but I wouldn't have gotten through this thing without a spiritual experience. A very real, a very lasting, and a very ongoing spiritual experience.
South African surgeon Dr. Christian Barnard performed the first successful human heart transplant 14 years ago. He trained in heart surgery at the University of Minnesota. The heart transplant program here at the U of M hospitals began 4 years ago. 10 transplants have been performed so far. 4 of the patients, including Jim Feehan, are still alive. And there will be more, thanks to a recent federal grant which is considered something of a milestone.
And basically what it means is that for the first time, the government is saying that heart transplantation in 6 institutions, of which this is one, is no longer experimental, and that they, in fact, will fund it to a limited degree as a pilot project to see what kind of federal funding will eventually emerge for heart transplantation. So the results are now that if you need a heart transplant, you have a 70% chance you'd be alive in a year and over 50% in 5 years. That's not experimental, considering that when you're accepted for heart transplant, the 90% chance you'd be dead in 2 months.
Tonight's program deals with death, but the stronger focus is on life and the chance to add a degree of sense to what at times may be a senseless tragedy. More organs are needed to offer hope and life. That can only be done by a donor. The ultimate gift is possible by calling for a donor card.
Full types of transplants. The cornea is the front clear part of the eye through which we normally see. It may become damaged from injury or disease, resulting in poor vision or blindness. The Minnesota Eye Bank provides after-death donor corneas for transplant. The Eye Bank was founded in 1960 with the support of the Minnesota Lions Club and the University Medical School's Department of Ophthalmology. Since then, more than 1,200 corneal transplants have been performed at the university.
The cornea has been transplanted successfully for the past 40, almost 50 years, long before the recent popularity of other organ transplants such as kidney and heart. The reason for this is the cornea seems to have a certain privilege against the rejection process. The site where the cornea exists seems to be the site of that privilege, and what this relates to is the cornea has no blood vessels normally. And because it has no blood vessels, the body doesn't recognize this as being something foreign, and therefore we can transplant the cornea without too much problem as far as rejection is concerned. If you take all cases of corneal transplantation for all kinds of reasons, 85% success rate is what we currently have, and that's a marked increase from even 10 years ago.
Ideally, eyes should be removed from donors 4 to 6 hours after death and transplanted within 24 hours. But a recent procedure developed at the University of Minnesota allows the cornea to be preserved in a chemical solution for up to 30 days without damaging the tissue. And since 1975, the university has conducted special training programs for morticians around the state. More than 200 Minnesota morticians now know how to remove corneas for transplant with the approval of the deceased person's family.
167.
The Bloomington Nooner Lions Club continues to raise money for the Eye Bank with raffles and other projects. One of the Lions members is Chuck Waletzko, who is a cornea recipient. Waletzko's surgery was done a year ago. Before surgery, he was nearly blind in his left eye. Today, his vision is quite normal.
If you want to see a real miracle, you should see what it's like when you're just standing there and all of a sudden you see your vision increasing. Matter of fact, there's still times now when my vision gets a little bit better, even to 20/20, and my wife always knows when that's happening because I'm going around like this, staring at people, particularly the female sex, and she knows that my vision has really kicked in then.
Craig Anderson is an engineering supervisor for Northwestern Bell. He's hoping for a successful corneal transplant in his left eye. For the past 20 years, Craig has suffered from a progressive disease called keratoconus.
The first thing I noticed was on the horizon. I could see a shadow, a shadowy line above the horizon. It was the first time I knew that something was wrong. This was in my left eye, and it was about 20 years ago. It starts first in one eye, and then about 10 years later in the other eye, and that has been the situation with me. It has started in the right eye now. 7 or 8 years ago we noticed that, and that is it's a condition that's in both of my eyes at this time.
Kimberly and Kevin Anderson look forward to their father's operation. They too may someday have similar eye problems because keratoconus may have a hereditary link. Barbara Anderson says her husband's second chance for normal vision has made her somewhat of a crusader.
We've talked it over and decided or should I just give my eyes or all organs, and I've chosen to give all organs. Whatever is good that they can use, they can have. And I've recruited other people since.
Craig Anderson's surgery is March 22nd and is performed by Dr. Doofman. The donor cornea is from the Minnesota Eye Bank. During the operation, Doofman removes Craig's diseased cornea with a technique similar to cutting out a cookie with a cookie cutter. The transplant tissue is then cut to size and sewn into place. Such delicate surgery requires Doofman to operate with the aid of a microscope, and the stitches are made with very thin nylon thread.
Using a running type baseball stitch, we place 16 to 20 bites around the circumference, 360 degrees, sewing the cornea in place. And then, since this nylon has a certain amount of elasticity, we have to pull that up a couple of times and finally make a single tie.
Have a seat right there, please. Very good. Well, how's it been going?
Oh, it's good. It feels comfortable.
No pain?
No pain at all.
A few weeks later, Craig gets his first checkup to see how the stitches are healing. The stitches will remain in place for 3 to 12 months. But already, Craig Anderson's vision is improved.
Oh, that looks super. Just fantastic. Look down, please. It's all epithelialized. It's all healed. Look up. Very little inflammation, straight ahead. And the transplant, the cornea, is nice, thin, and clear. That's what we want to see at this stage.
Good.
Beautiful.
It feels comfortable, too.
73-year-old Gus Ryerson suffered from an ulcer on his right cornea. A transplant offered Gus and his wife Hulda a chance for increased mobility in their retirement years.
With me, I suppose one of the bigger frustrations was I couldn't drive the car anymore, and liked to read, and reading became pretty cumbersome. I really had to use a magnifying glass to read.
100,000 Minnesotans could benefit today from a corneal transplant, but because of the limited number of donor tissues, only a few hundred transplants are performed each year. Gus Ryerson was scheduled for a transplant operation on March 12th, but unfortunately he died of a sudden heart attack 3 days before the surgery. The severe shortage of donor tissues means thousands of people like Gus Ryerson face the prospect of never getting a transplant in time. The University of Minnesota Ear Bank in Minneapolis is deeply involved in transplant research as well as prevention of ear disease. Here, preserved temporal bones are processed and put on slides for study. All the donors of these bones were documented cases of disease or hearing loss. Minnesota's collection of more than 1,200 of these specimens is one of the largest in the world. Researchers hope to uncover ways to better diagnose and treat hearing problems by studying these diseased tissues. Meanwhile, dramatic advances have been made recently in the transplantation of the eardrum and small bones of the middle ear. The Minneapolis Ear Bank is part of a national system for collecting and distributing middle ear tissues for transplantation. Dr. George Lisinski recently visited the Minneapolis Ear Bank. Dr. Lisinski performs middle ear transplants for the Ear Bank in Cincinnati, Ohio, and he is a leading authority in transplant surgery. Lisinski says the surgery is not a cure-all for every ear disease and hearing loss, but the technique has already helped thousands whose hearing had been damaged by infection, injury, or disease.
Ear transplant is limited to transplanting the middle ear bones and now more recently the eardrum. We cannot transplant the inner ear, the cochlea, or the hearing nerve.
A Cincinnati man died in January, and tissue from his middle ear was distributed here through the National Ear Bank. Dr. Timothy Jung of the Minneapolis Ear Bank examined the tissue and removed the tympanic membrane, or eardrum, for transplant surgery at the University of Minnesota hospitals.
The transplant of the middle ear tissue is a little different than the transplant of the kidney or heart or some other transplants, because we use a human tissue, but it's actually not really living tissue. It's a fixed, and actually it's a, you can call it dead tissue, but this will work because it will work as a scaffold, and the living tissue will grow over it. Now I'm going to flip this over. Now we're looking from outside in, or from lateral view. Here's the rim of the tympanic membrane. Here's the tympanic membrane proper part.
The donated eardrum was stored in a special solution at the ear bank. A few days later, Dr. Jung transplanted the eardrum into Jane Donnell of Red Lake, Minnesota. Her left eardrum had been badly damaged by infection, resulting in deafness. 2 weeks after the operation, Dr. Jung examines Jane Donnell. He removes the packing, which has been in place since the surgery. Full healing may take several more weeks, but the early signs are already very encouraging.
Before I couldn't hear nothing, where now I could hear some, but I hope I could get, I hope it gets better.
She does have some nerve type of loss. She won't, that part won't get better. But in a month or two, I think her hearing will improve a lot.
Considered experimental. As we've seen, kidney and corneal transplants are already highly successful. The University of Minnesota's experience with these types of operations has achieved over 90% success rates. And major advances are taking place with transplants of the middle eardrum and human heart. In addition, more than 20 other body organs and tissues could now be successfully transplanted, including the pancreas, bone marrow, skin, and liver.
Now, do you need the meds?
64-year-old Jessie Font of Minneapolis had a liver transplant last fall at the University of Minnesota hospitals. Font daily mixes into a glass of milk a new type of anti-rejection drug called cyclosporin A. This drug is being tested experimentally at the university, and researchers are optimistic it will greatly reduce rejection problems for many types of transplants. So far, the drug works perfectly for Jessie Font. His only problem is with the size of the donor organ.
It is a bigger liver than I had, so it kind of gave me a little bit of a potbelly, which I never had before. But other than that, I don't really think too much about it. It's really tremendous that people donate their organs for this type of thing.
Along with helping test anti-rejection drugs, university researchers are helping us learn a lot more about the body's immune system, that complex mechanism that recognizes disease and foreign tissue and defends against them. University immunologist Fritz Bach says the future of transplantation will be largely unlimited if we can unlock the body's code of self-defense. Dr. Bach notes that animal tissues such as pig valves have already been successfully transplanted into humans, and he foresees other possibilities for using animal tissue in humans.
There is some hope, and although I'm sure not everybody would agree with me, let me express it personally at least, that for certain kinds of transplantation, we may even be able to get the tissue to be transplanted from another species. I think let me give one example first. A man by the name of Keith Reemsma, who's now professor of surgery at Columbia Presbyterian in New York, transplanted a kidney, I think it was from a chimpanzee, but it was from one of the non-human primates, a monkey, to a human. And that kidney survived and functioned for 11 months. I think there's every reason to believe, and I think it's in the area of the transplantation of islets to children who need insulin production for diabetes, that we may well be able to go to monkeys. I think the techniques that have been worked out, which I mentioned earlier, in terms of our understanding as to why islets are rejected or are not rejected, may well allow us to manipulate the islets from something like baboons so that they can be transplanted to humans and not be rejected and yet function.
There are literally tens of thousands of people in the nation waiting for an organ transplant. Only a fraction of them will get the organ they need because there aren't enough donors.
Okay, wanted to be on the donor program?
Yes, I did.
All right, this is the application that we have you fill in, and then we can be witnesses for you.
Okay.
All righty. And for your new driver's license, I need your signature between those little brackets.
In Minnesota, only about 4% of the state's licensed drivers are donors. It's easy to do. Simply mark the donor box when renewing your license. You can also call the University of Minnesota Donor Program. They can answer any questions about organ donation. Whether or not you become a donor is a personal decision. Those who do extend to the living the ultimate gift.
Tonight's special presentation of The Ultimate Gift has been brought to you